The dust from the battlefield had barely settled when the soldiers found her. Princess Stateira of Egypt stood in the centre of her tent, surrounded by silk cushions and golden oil lamps, dressed in the royal blue that marked her as Pharaoh's daughter. Outside, the screams of the dying mixed with the victory cries of Persian forces. Her father's army had been annihilated at Pelusium. The Achaemenid Empire had just swallowed Egypt whole, and she knew exactly what that meant for a woman of royal blood. The Persian commander who entered her tent didn't draw his sword. He bowed respectfully, terrifyingly. "Princess," he said in accented Egyptian, "you are now under the protection of the King of Kings." Protection. The word hung in the air like poisoned honey. She had heard the stories whispered in palace corridors. Tales of what happened to royal women when the Persians came. Now she would learn if those stories were true. If you're drawn to the carefully concealed practices of ancient empires and what happened when royal bloodlines collided, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more accounts hidden in cuneiform tablets, Greek fragments, and archaeological discoveries that rewrote everything we thought we knew. Now, back to the story. The Persians didn't treat captured royalty like common prisoners. They had developed something far more sophisticated, a system that transformed conquered queens and princesses into instruments of imperial policy. It was documented in palace records, mentioned in tribute lists, encoded in marriage contracts. But for 1,000 years, these documents remained buried, untranslated, deliberately obscured by later dynasties that found the practices too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Stateira was taken to a fortified camp where other royal captives waited under guard. She recognised some faces: Princess Ametis of Lydia, Queen Tamiris's daughter from the Massage Tay, Lady Roxana of Bactria. Each woman represented a conquered kingdom, a humiliated dynasty, a political alliance that had failed. Together they formed what Persian officials called the Anushia, the household of subjugation. The term appears in Elamite tablets discovered at Persepolis in 1933, clinical and precise in its bureaucratic cruelty. These weren't concubines in the traditional sense, they were symbols, living proof that Persian power extended even into the sacred spaces of royal bloodlines. When a king fell in battle, his wife became Persian property. When a dynasty collapsed, its princesses became assets to be deployed in whatever way best served the empire. The system was documented in administrative records with the same attention to detail as grain shipments and tax collection. The journey to Persepolis took 3 months. The royal captives travelled in covered wagons, guarded by an elite unit called the Immortals. They were fed well, kept clean, given medicine when needed. This wasn't mercy, it was quality control. Damaged goods had less value, and these women were destined for purposes that required them to maintain their royal bearing. Stateira spent those months watching the landscape transform from Egyptian desert to Mesopotamian plains to the highlands of Persis. Each mile took her farther from everything she had known. The other women rarely spoke. What was there to say? They had all lost the same things: fathers, brothers, husbands, kingdoms. Words couldn't bridge that particular abyss. When they finally reached Persepolis, the scale of Persian power became overwhelming. The palace complex stretched across the plain like a stone mountain, its columns reaching toward the sky, its walls carved with endless processions of tribute bearers from every corner of the known world. Stateira saw herself in those carvings, foreign nobility bringing gifts to the King of Kings, Yongju frozen in stone, forever bowing. They were taken to a section of the palace called the Paradiadam, the enclosed garden. From the outside, it looked like paradise: fountains, fruit trees, pavilions with silk curtains. But the walls were high, the gates were guarded, and no one entered or left without imperial permission. This was a gilded prison designed to house royal captives until their usefulness could be determined. A palace administrator arrived the next day with scribes. Each woman was interviewed, her lineage meticulously recorded, her languages documented, her skills assessed. The administrator asked questions that seemed innocuous but carried devastating implications. Could she read, write, manage accounts, bear children? Each answer shaped her fate. The Persians had refined the categorization of royal captives into a precise system. Some would be married to Persian nobles to legitimize their rule over conquered territories. Others would be kept at court as living trophies, paraded before visiting dignitaries. A few would be sent to provincial governors as rewards for loyal service. The most valuable, young, beautiful, educated, of impeccable bloodlines, would enter the imperial harem, not as wives but as paradida, kept women, a status that appeared in administrative texts but was never fully explained in public records. Stateira learned her fate 3 weeks after arrival. She would not be married off. She would not be sent to a governor. She would remain at Persepolis, assigned to the household of King Cambyses himself. The administrator delivered this news as if announcing a great honour. "You will serve the King of Kings directly," he said. "Your bloodline will be preserved in service to the empire." She understood what he meant. She would bear children, but they would be Persian, raised in Persian customs, taught to see Egypt as a conquered province, rather than their mother's homeland. Her royal blood would be diluted, absorbed, neutralised. Within a generation, her descendants wouldn't even remember they had Egyptian ancestry. That night she met the other women assigned to Cambyses' household, 17 in total, each from a different conquered kingdom. They lived in adjoining chambers within the palace, their lives structured around the rhythms of imperial preference. When the king desired company, they were summoned. When he didn't, they waited. Days could pass in silence. Then suddenly a eunuch would appear, speaking a name, and someone would rise and disappear behind the heavy curtains that separated their world from his. Princess Amitis, who had been there longest, explained the unspoken rules. Never speak of your homeland with affection. Never mention your family. Never suggest that life before was better. He doesn't want to hear about dead kings and fallen kingdoms. To him, we're flowers in his garden, beautiful, contained, ultimately disposable. The comparison wasn't metaphorical. Palace records discovered at Persepolis list the royal captives, alongside inventories of exotic plants, rare animals, and precious objects. A tablet from 522 BCE mentions 17 women of royal blood maintained at palace expense, in the same section that catalogues 23 peacocks from India and 42 cypress trees from Lebanon. All of them were acquisitions, proof of Persian reach and power. What happened within the imperial household remained hidden for centuries because the Persians themselves obscured it. Official inscriptions praised the King of Kings as just and merciful. Royal proclamations spoke of protecting the weak and honouring tradition. But the administrative archives told a different story, a story of systematic exploitation dressed in the language of imperial benevolence. Stateira bore 3 children over 8 years, 2 sons and a daughter. She named them Egyptian names in whispers, but they were registered with Persian ones. The boys were taken at age 5 to be raised as Persian nobility, trained as soldiers and administrators. She saw them occasionally, formal visits where they called her by title, rather than recognising her as mother. By age 10, they spoke only Persian. By 15, they commanded units against Egyptian rebels. Her bloodline had been turned against itself. The daughter remained longer, kept in the women's quarters, until marriage age. But she too was raised Persian, taught to see Egyptian culture as primitive and backward. When she was finally married to a Persian general, Stateira wasn't allowed to attend the ceremony. The administrator explained gently, "It would confuse her to see you as mother rather than palace fixture." Other royal captives fared worse. Queen Tamiris's daughter Sparithra refused to bear children for her captors. She was given every incentive, every threat, but she remained defiant. After 3 years, she was quietly transferred to a remote palace in Bactria, where she disappeared from all records. Later accounts discovered in Greek fragments suggest she was eventually married to a local governor who had no idea of her royal heritage. She died in childbirth, far from her people, her name erased from history. Princess Roxana of Bactria took a different path. She learned Persian faster than anyone, mastered court etiquette, made herself indispensable to palace administration. Within 5 years, she was managing the household of royal women, essentially becoming a jailer for her fellow captives. The Persians rewarded her with privileges, her own quarters, fine clothing, authority over others. She had found a way to survive, even thrive within the system. The other women hated her for it, but perhaps she had simply accepted the truth they couldn't. Resistance was futile. Adaptation was survival. The system continued for generations. When Cambyses died, His successor Darius inherited the royal captives, along with the rest of the empire. Some women had been in the paradiadam for decades by then, their youth gone, their purpose exhausted. These were quietly moved to provincial palaces. Given small estates, allowed to fade into obscurity. A few administrative texts mention provisions for aged royal dependents, budget lines that acknowledged their existence without explaining their origins. New conquests brought new captives. When Darius crushed the Ionian revolt, the wives and daughters of rebel leaders were brought to Persepolis. When he invaded Scythia, captured noblemen joined the household. The palace became a living museum of Persian dominance, each woman a testament to a defeated people. The Greeks who later wrote about Persian luxury mentioned these women only in passing. Herodotus noted that the Persian king kept many women of foreign royal birth, but provided no details about their lives or treatment. Xenophon described the Persian court's magnificence, but carefully avoided discussing the imprisoned royalty. It was as if they had tacitly agreed to maintain Persian secrecy, either out of respect for the dead or perhaps because the truth was too uncomfortable to document. The real evidence remained buried at Persepolis, written in Elamite on clay tablets that wouldn't be excavated until the 20th century. The discovery of the fortification tablets between 1933 and 1934 changed everything. Suddenly, historians had access to detailed administrative records spanning decades. Among the mundane entries about grain rations and wine distributions were references to the royal women, their names, their origins, the resources allocated for their maintenance. One tablet, designated PF Day 1795, reads, 37.5 bar of wine, supplied to Stateira the Egyptian and her household, by order of the king, month 12, year 19 of Darius. This single line confirmed she had existed, had been maintained at royal expense, had survived long enough to establish what Persian bureaucracy called a household, probably the children taken from her. Another tablet mentions provisions for the women of the enclosed garden, listing quantities of flour, oil, meat, and wine. The amounts were generous, confirming that the captives were well fed and cared for, but the clinical language couldn't hide the underlying reality. These were rations for prisoners, however gilded their cage. The most revealing document wasn't discovered until 1969, during renewed excavations at Persepolis. It was a seal impression on a clay tablet, showing a royal woman presenting a child to a seated king. The accompanying text, in both Elamite and Old Persian, described the ceremony of bloodline absorption, where children born to royal captives were formally recognised as Persian subjects. The document explained that this practice transforms the strength of conquered peoples into the strength of the empire, as their noblest blood now flows in service to the King of Kings. This was the hidden truth. The Persians weren't just conquering kingdoms, they were harvesting bloodlines. Royal captives weren't spoils of war, they were reproductive resources in a long-term strategy of genetic and cultural assimilation. The practice was so systematic, so carefully documented in internal records, yet so completely absent from public monuments that it remained invisible for a millennium after the empire fell. When Alexander the Great conquered Persepolis in 330 BCE, he found the paradiadam still functioning. Plutarch mentions that Alexander freed many women of royal descent who had been held for years, but provides no names or details. Some historians believe Alexander himself participated in the system, taking Roxana of Bactria, possibly a descendant of the original captive princess Roxana, as his wife. The cycle continued under new management. The Seleucid Greeks who inherited the Persian Empire maintained modified versions of the practice. The Parthians and Sassanids did the same. Each dynasty refined the system, made it more sophisticated, buried it deeper in bureaucratic language. By the time Islamic historians began documenting Persian history, the practice had been so thoroughly integrated into imperial administration that no one thought to question it. It wasn't until modern archaeology provided hard evidence, tablets, seals, administrative text, that the full scope became clear. And even then, many scholars hesitated to confront the implications. Early 20th century historians described the paradiadam as a protective institution, where royal women were sheltered from the chaos of conquest. It took decades before anyone dared to call it what the evidence suggested, a systematic program of cultural erasure through reproductive control. Stateira lived until she was 53, an unusually long life for the period. Palace records mention her death in 495 BCE, noting the distribution of her few personal possessions to other household members. She was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the palace complex. When archaeologists excavated the royal cemetery in the 1970s, they found dozens of unidentified female skeletons, many showing markers of good nutrition and comfortable living. Any one of them could have been Stateira. Her story survives only in fragments: a name on a wine ration tablet, a mention in a tribute list, a seal impression showing a faceless woman presenting a child to a king. But those fragments are enough to reconstruct what the Persians hid and what later historians were reluctant to confront. That empire wasn't built only with swords and tribute, but with the systematic exploitation of women whose only crime was being born into the wrong dynasty at the wrong time. The practice persisted in various forms for over 1,000 years, from the rise of Cyrus the Great to the fall of the Achaemenid Empire. Tens of thousands of royal women passed through the system, their names mostly lost, their lives reduced to budget entries in administrative archives. They were history's ghost prisoners, well documented in clay and ink, completely absent from the grand narratives of empire. If you've heard this story tonight, understand that we know about it only because archaeologists in the 1930s decided to excavate bureaucratic archives that everyone assumed would be boring. Inside those clay tablets was evidence of a system so efficient, so normalised, that it operated for centuries without anyone outside the palace questioning it. The Persians didn't hide these practices out of shame, they hid them because royal captives were classified as internal, administrative matters, no more worthy of public inscription than grain storage or horse breeding. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt reading about what they endured. And if you want more stories that empires buried in their own archives, subscribe and step deeper into the shadows with us. Because some truths only emerge when we dig beneath the monuments and read what was never meant to be read.